let's call this meeting of the Policy Committee to order. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve.
Second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Agenda is approved. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Motion to approve the consent agenda.
Seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Consent agenda has been approved. So we have one policy to look at today, which is the attendance policy. The committee members have been able to look at a draft in some detail and exchange ideas and questions with the team that's been working on it. We'll do some of that today as well. So I guess what I'm thinking of maybe as a starting point, actually I have a question. Is there great urgency? When does this need to get balanced?
So let me give you a little, I think it's good to give you some background around this. So this isn't entirely a brain policy. I think as you've seen, this was one that we needed to do some updating. So some of the things that we've done is we started this last year, right, Mark? I believe like maybe
started
we kind of ended off starting it last year, and then this year we really had a heavy focus on doing a lot of the research and creating what you have in front of you. We also did a lot of stakeholder feedback groups where we had principals and APs have a look at it. We also did one with our parent group. I think you did one.
We did DWAC,
our community group. So we got a lot of different.
we did one with our student, student advisory board and superintendent, each with also gave us feedback. We did it with teacher cabinet.
Yep. So we went through a lot of different, we had a lot of different people review and give feedback, which has now grown into the document that you have in front of you. So we are a little bit at an urgency, and the urgency is one, just urgency in general, that we need to get our students to come to school. I think we all know that that's important, that we need, in order for students to learn, they have to be present at their schools. Are there a lot of factors that can prohibit a student or pose a challenge? Absolutely. One of the things that we also, as you all know, is we have a very rigorous tackle around attendance, which is why we, in looking at last year and looking at what our current policy was, we felt that there were some pieces in there that didn't support the work that we needed to do in order to move that tackle, which is around chronic absenteeism. And so that's why we were really, really rigorous in trying to get this, approved this year, because our hope is to do sharing of this over the summer, especially with admin during their SLA week, and also get it out to schools to really help support with the attendance teams. Now, a couple of things that we have heard from parents is that this is a need. We've heard a lot of different parents share how they felt that different schools interpret the policy different ways, and their experience isn't the same. And we heard a lot of frustration around that. And I think Mark and I wholeheartedly agree, which is why we wanted to make sure that the policy that we have is something that we share with schools and share with families, so that way everybody is held to the same equitable standard. So if you're at, an elementary school, you have this, it's the same policy for you, or it's, how do I want to say, it's still done the same way, even if you go to high school, that the expectations are the same and that families are all getting the same message. That's not happening.
So one thing to interrupt, and my apologies, is that equity and equality are not the same.
Correct.
Right? And so we can give the different levels the same message, but not all. It doesn't mean that they need the same message. And what I mean by that is we have youth who their parents don't speak the language, they are not engaged, they have 3 jobs like me, and they're not going to read this paper when it comes home. They're not going to be able to understand it, even if it comes in Spanish, because maybe they have a different language, a different Spanish language, and they're depending on their child to tell them when school is open and when school is closed. So everybody receiving the same policy is not equity.
Well, I think we would give them this, because I mean, it's very dense, right? Like, it's a dense document.
I agree, yeah.
You have to put it in, parent-friendly language
Mhm.
to help support, so that way they all put in, and we have a responsibility to translate that in every language that our families speak. And, we have a lot of great interpretations, services to do that. So that's something absolutely, we will do. But
The
we,
Family and Community Engagement Office,
Yeah,
which
it's
has a new,
supporting
head of, chief, Karina Pinto, and her, she has a real aggressive plan for getting this out to the community in parent-friendly language, almost like a 1 or 2 pages to say, here are the basic requirements of our attendance policy and plan. I know talking with James, we want to try to hit community events this summer. We want to try to get the word out about attendance in as many venues as possible. I know that's what Karina is planning on doing with myself and with other members from the district. Because you're right, equality is an equity, right? And also how we may interpret something or how we incorporate an intervention at an elementary level or a middle level or a high school level, or depending on the family circumstances. That's why in the policy it talks about an individually tailored attendance plan
correct. To
per
meet the
student. So that, what you're saying absolutely happens for every individual kid, because student A is not the same for student B, student C, student D, right? So, and that's spelled out in the policy. But
And that's new.
That's new.
Something new.
That's something new to address the equality piece. And when we also did this, we also had Napoleonian, our chief of equity, also
Put our eyes on it.
put her eyes on this, made some comments. But we also, for the first time ever in this district, they're gonna have a comprehensive regulation/handbook that'll go with this. That'll spell out and explain a lot of the questions that you both had. In this, it'll actually give you almost like the playbook for attendance that'll not only go to schools, it'll go to parents, and it'll be interpreted in many different languages as well.
Would you say that playbook will be tailored to the school? The reason why I ask is because you responded in one of your comments that school days are different for school start time and time, the amount of school hours are different per school, right? And
By level, elementary, middle, and high.
correct.
And the reason I wasn't so definitive in the actual time was because that could change from year to year, like you see how much adding a half hour onto the school day now. So to keep it a little general, so we don't have to keep going in and changing the policy, that's the only reason I did that. I totally
That's
agree
fine,
with you.
but the other document, the one that's gonna go from the school, that one will be tailored to the school.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let me give you a little bit, and we apologize we don't have it ready, but that's actually taken the most amount of time because
That's a lot.
we're building in what are the interventions? So to your point, there's always a reason why students don't come to school. There's a lot of reasons. And we've done a lot of research this year of reasons why they don't come, and it's a wide range. Some has been there's still a little bit of COVID, families are still a little afraid. There's also, which I think is dwindling a little bit, but that has been one of the reasons. Also, culture at buildings was a very big one for kids.
Yeah.
Safety was another really big one. And then another one was also around non-engagement, didn't feel engaged in things we would expect. But then we also have some other that are circumstances, right? Like you mentioned, mom or dad who work, jobs, they have kids at 3 different schools. So we know that there are very special circumstances. So the reason we want to put the regulations together, and it'll work similar to home instruction and homeschool, is we want to have a document that schools can go to that will support what's here. So if we're saying, we want this tailored plan, well, what does it look like? We want to give them examples. We want to give them, these are the resources you can use in order to support. Because I think one of the things that we, Mark and I have talked about is we have to stop thinking of attendance just like it's our office. It's really a community. It's not just, schools or even us as a district, it's the entire community. How are we holding kids accountable? We did a community walk, I think it was in the late winter, and we were at the mall, and I don't want to call out the school, but we must have seen about 10, 12 kids, and I was like, why aren't you in class? Why aren't you in class? And they were like, yes, right? But those are the kinds of, kinds of things we want everyone to be, responsible for attendance. So that's why Mark has been really partnering with ACE with, doing some community events to really get that word out, how can you help us to ensure that we're getting our kids to school?
Yeah.
And to me, that's what the important part is getting the kids to school. Because we know there no kind of achievement will happen unless we can get kids to school. So we have to go be all hands on deck. And so we're going to be rolling out, a plan. Schools will be getting lists of students who have been chronically absent over the year, and their expectations that we meet with those families, or students if they're high school, to develop a plan. Like, what is it that we can do to support you through a supportive lens, right? We actually took out a lot of the punitive language that was in here. In the past one, if you've noticed, we really tried to make it,
And I still found it harsh.
I
still found it
My
harsh.
family, like, oh, we cut a lot out already.
I didn't see the previous one, but I think one of the things, I've been sitting at tables where we're talking about chronic absenteeism since 2011. When the CYC was started and all of that with Rebecca Fox, and we tried to do, full service community schools, and we were in schools and we were trying, I just can't, in my brain, I can't figure out why we can't, figure this out. But one of the things we talked about the mall, when I went to school in New York City, any kid who was outside of home or school during the day, cops would take them to school, back to school. Cops would pick us up and take us to school. And so when you mention community, I don't know, what do we do to make sure that at least that part, that's different, right? That's sort of like cutting school. Versus the parent didn't drop the child off. And I also went, when I was at Forts and Reservoir, Forts started at 8 a.m. So I had to drop one kid off at 8 a.m., wait in the car until 9 a.m. But by the way, I started work at 8:30, right, to drop off my 9-year-old at Reservoir Avenue School. So what can the district do so that our kids are not split up like that? It's tough, but
it is hard. But I think that's why it's really important when we're having conversations with either families or students about why they're absent. The most important piece that we try to instill in attendance teams is to understand the why. Nobody just says, most people don't just say, I'm not going to come to school today. I mean, teenagers are teenagers, but for the most part, right? Same thing with moms and dads. It's not that they don't want to take their child to school. They have circumstances or issues. I don't want to keep blaming COVID, but we have a lot of kids who are suffering. We have a lot of students who have school anxiety. We have a lot of students who virtual learning made them comfortable at home, and they have really struggled to come back. So we're still dealing with those kinds of SEL and mental health needs. So the why is very important, because once you know the why, then you can help to solve it. Sometimes, being a past principal, there have been times I've put in requests to move kids so that way they are at the same school. So that way, parent doesn't have to do 2 or 3 runs when it's possible. Asking for transportation, helping connect families with, and I know there's people in the neighborhood that can, support and bring their child. So, a lot of the school communities know that information because they know their community. So I think part of this is that we want to make sure that, the community realizes how important attendance is and that we'll support them, but we also need them to understand that, they do have to come. Because on the other hand, we also have sometimes situations where we have, kids that are go on vacation for 3 or 4 months. Yeah. And that is really tricky, right? They might have certain circumstances. We get a lot of times ailing, parent, ailing grandparent, and we understand that we understand that. However, that has serious effects on that child's education, but also effects on our attendance, which we're held accountable to.
Is it vacation or do they drop and come back with informal?
So they'll go on vacation and they'll come back, and that's one of the things we've changed in the policy. We can't allow them that long period of time, and it's not that we want to hold harm anybody and we don't want to put them back at their school, but that hurts that school's attendance, especially when we have wait lists of kids that that are waiting for spots, they're holding up a spot. So that was one thing. Another major thing that we also did here is we cleaned up a lot with those students that are not showing up within the first 5 days, which happens quite a bit. We have a lot of transiency amongst sometimes the district, but also amongst other schools in the state, or if they go to a charter and whatnot. So we want schools also to be, really on top of that, so that way they're, making sure they're removing those students after they verify that they've moved to the other, another district.
I was gonna ask that, what was the consequence, because it happened to me where we moved, and a month later, I was still getting absences, and I kept calling the secretary and saying, hey, we moved that, like, we're not in that school anymore, but we kept getting the app, like, your child is absent, your child is absent, okay. So it would be.
We have an actual protocol that we give them now, and it's like a checklist, and we do it by
Awesome.
day. So, on day 1, this is what you should do, on day 2, this is what you should do.
And we actually tried to put that language in the policy so everybody's clear, and then we'll also put that in the regulations document as well with some how-tos and with that checklist.
So I just have a question about data. So some of my comments in here were about this. It's kind of the same thing I had for the MTSS and the other ones, is to make sure that what's learned at the building level filters back up and then filters back down and learning. So, we need to know the why, that's part of seeing kids and their families as whole people with real lives. So how does that, there's lots of little whys, and then that aggregates into several categories of whys that we will see as kind of common across the district. And I'm wondering how that information filters up.
So right now, not as effective as we would want it to. The schools complete the community outreach form, which can be cumbersome, but basically whenever they do an outreach with a parent, they would put the reason there, why there. And that's how we've gathered the evidence we've had for this year and last year. However, it's a very cumbersome form that they have to fill out. So one of the great things is we're trying to incorporate, and I'm sure you heard this with MTSS, we're trying to incorporate attendance as part of like that behavior piece. So MTSS split 3 ways: academics, behavior, and SEL. So we're trying to incorporate academics, and I think, it can fit in either behavior or SEL in some cases, right? So one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to do a one-stop shop. So at the last school board, thank you, you approved our Branching Minds contract. So what Branching Minds is, it's one of our platforms that will house all of our intervention data. In the past, it's all been, handwritten in a folder, and you hope that it makes it with the child, right, to the new school, because if it doesn't, you have to start fresh. So same thing with attendance. There's been a lot of outreach that's been done with these families, but there's no way to kind of keep it tracked. So what we're trying to do is, and we actually are going to be meeting with Branching Minds next week to see what are, how can we track those interventions and put it all in one platform. So when we're looking at the child, we can see their academics, we can see what their attendance is, we can see the behavior. It really have one platform that kind of brings it together.
So this year was the first time that we actually created a district-wide individual tailored attendance plan. It was a template, but schools put in their own information and they make it specific to each individual student, right, based on their circumstance. But we actually were able to house that. It's not easy to put in, but it's actually housed in Skyward. So yes,
I wrote that.
yes. So it's housed in Skyward, so we can actually go in and view it as
I can go in
yes.
to my son's Skyward
Yes.
and I can see
Yes.
excused or unexcused.
Yes, and there's an individual, and if your son had an individual tailored attendance plan, that's also in Skyward, but it's a customized form. So for us to pull it as a district, I have to have somebody else run the report for me. I just can't go in, like Sandy said, and pull up, a semester, how many kids do we have in a semester that have individual tailored attendance plans? Print it out, get the list of kids. We can get it, but it's very antiquated through Skyward. And we also have another customized form, which is the community outreach form that Sandy mentioned, which this year, any phone call, email, parent contact, any outreach that happens, it goes into this form. But again, it's a custom form. So I can't go in and view someone has to print the report. So for me, overseeing attendance, it makes it very difficult. right? But we're fixing those problems with this new system. This year, for example, we've made over 27,000 outreach attempts just for attendance to parents in all our schools. So we've done a lot of outreach to families in regards to chronic absenteeism, attendance, why students aren't attending school. And we do have that information documented, but to Mark's point, that flow back and forth isn't necessarily smooth. It hopefully will be as we move forward. And I know you had mentioned wanting, regular data sent to school boards so you could review, right? And I added something in there to address what you said. I put quarterly or as requested. So however you decide as a board, you want to see the information, it's in the policy now.
Because that information is easy to grab.
But we'll be able to grab that and get that to you regularly,
That information meaning both the numbers, but also the why, or at least some.
We
obviously not the why.
definitely,
able to
we
do
could be
the
able to give you the rates, we could drop, we could segregate it in any different way you want to, like, we could share what's the daily attendance, we could share what the chronic absenteeism, we could share it by elementary, middle, and high, we could share it by school, like, we have it all, in that way now in Elevate, which is great. That was another game changer added this year. That was
Yes,
great.
that was a game changer. Elevate was a game
We can,
changer.
like, pull it up and say, okay, we know there's, here's a chronic, at the high school, and so that was a really big game changer. We also spent the whole entire year going through and supporting school attendance teams to just be able to know how to use that because it was new. So all year, that's what Mark set up was all the attendance teams. Next year, we want to really go into more of like a student support team. So we're trying to stay away from like, here's the MTSS team, here's the attendance team, here's the target team. We're trying to make it one team, so we're looking at kids holistic. Because at the end of the day, one of those always affects the other. So we want to make one team to be able to look at that. So that is something that, Mark's team has done a really great job. But again, as we were doing those visits with them, this always came up, the policy. The policy prohibits us from doing some of these things. The policy prohibits us. So a lot of that, yes, which is why, the old one, which is why we've made the changes.
So the old one made references to things like
Truancy
truancy core and things of that nature.
So
We
they
removed
wouldn't
all-
do it so the child wouldn't get in trouble.
We removed all of that stuff.
Was it that?
Um,
Like what was, what?
Well, like the extra days, like for example, what was it, 15 or 20 days they were allowed, we've scaled that down, 'cause that's, way too many. I'm trying to think what else we had in
so
there.
in the old form, there was something called an 88 form.
Oh, 80.
Where if you were out 10 consecutive days, they would come up with this 88 form. It would be sent to a truancy officer. And then that truancy officer would take that form, see if they could make contact with the family. If they couldn't, they would file a court petition to send that family to truancy court. Instead of trying to be supportive and find out the why are you sending them to truancy court?
Or waiting 10 days.
Yeah, or waiting 10 days, right? So now, after, and I believe we put that in the policy, after day one, the section where you would ask me about, you would make a comment about the tiers, right? So I went in and even added, after day one, a phone call is made, right? So you're not, the old policy said after 10 days, so we fixed a lot of that to become much more restorative and much more supportive and much more responsive to what happens when a kid's actually absent, rather than accumulating all of these days, right?
So, each school has a student support team, right?
Well, they don't know it yet, but that's gonna be part of the.
They all had a
They all know.
They all had an
Around.
attendance team this year, but we changed it to
Yeah.
that.
We're gonna be training them, that's it. So we had to get our policy first, right? Like our MTSS policy, now we have our attendance. So now the next piece will be really breaking that down for schools, so they know, understand what this means, what their team should be. So we're building up all of that now, like who should be on your team, what are the goals on the team, so that way we can start rolling that out to schools. That's an important piece.
On page 2, where that definition is the student support team, I asked the question with language about an attendance subcommittee. Was a school may choose to establish an attendance
Yeah,
subcommittee?
and
Is there an argument for requiring all schools to have an attendance subcommittee of the student support team?
So we kind of talked about this. Part of how I think and we're still having conversations on the best way to implement this, but for me, the piece of the student support team would be where they would talk about what's the intervention for that child. So if Mark isn't coming to school because he has school anxiety, well, okay, who's gonna be that, check and connect with Mark, who's gonna be the person to connect them with some services, so it's those conversations. If they wanted to have a separate attendance team to branch off, I'm thinking that is mostly to kind of really look at the just school-wide data. So one of the important things as a principal you have to do is look at your data in a whole. Which grade level is there, where you're having more, and then have some more like targeted as a school. So I think the student support team is more to look at individual students who get referred versus the other team can just be more like looking at the data, determining tier 1 for the entire school. So it has a little separate of a little.
Yeah,
separate of
that's
a-
right.
But do we want each school, I would think we would want each school to have an attendance subcommittee. We can think of it as a subcommittee of the student support team, or think of it as a.
Yeah,
I think they do, like, my understanding is that schools do have attendance.
they do right now,
Yeah.
because we got them started this year, because we found
Do all
that
of
some,
them?
yes, the whole,
They all
after
do that.
this year,
No, they
yes.
all do that, they all do that.
Yes, we had everyone
And
has.
in the policy, it even writes to what Sandy was getting at, that the subcommittee would focus exclusively on cultivating a culture around attendance and a school culture that, like, right? So it would almost, rather than, because the student support team wouldn't maybe necessarily.
No, they would be talking more about individual children.
Yeah.
However, a school might decide, like, for example, some schools have data teams. So it might just be part of that data, their data team or their leadership team, that they talk about the data through that way. So we try to be, it's
We didn't wanna
difficult
tie
because we
their
don't want to
hands.
be too prescriptive either, because we want schools to have voice and choice
Yeah.
in how, their teams run. But at the end of the day, we want just two goals. We want them to make sure that they're addressing, and that they're referring kids who are, which again, the majority of our kids who are having academic concerns or behavior concerns normally have attendance issues. That's a, correlation. And then the second one is we want to make sure that they're looking at their data at their school, so that way they can, really be targeting, like, are they going to do, which classroom the month of January had the best attendance, or what, a lot of schools already do that now. You walk in some schools, they have, at the door, what's the class attendance, that's separate piece.
And then conversely, then after I read your comment, I was thinking, do we even need an engineer? Do we could just take that out?
Right, we
A
can put it,
subcommittee, I don't know.
we
could
can
talk
put
about
it
I
in
don't know.
the, guidance too.
We could put it in the guidance maybe and take it out of this
Yeah.
section,
Yeah.
and we could put that in guidance.
I mean, the reason I'm asking
However,
is I know, from when I was on the task force way back when, looking at the correlations between chronic absenteeism and how far kids, especially elementary school kids, lived from their schools, and there were, strong correlations there. There are fairly large differences in rates of chronic absenteeism between schools. Some schools are able to create a culture and a process that seems to encourage attendance, and others don't succeed at that. So I guess there's sort of a carrot and stick aspect to this, which is that, I want to make sure the policy holds the adults responsible for doing the work, right? Because if one elementary school has very low chronic absenteeism and another one has much higher chronic absenteeism, there's a lot of variables that could be out of the hands of the school for sure.
Absolutely.
Explain those things, but it also could be that the one school has hit on some stuff that really works. So we want to make sure that learning takes place in a sort of horizontal way, and we've created a structure for that. But the other is to make sure when principals are being evaluated, that this data is part of how we evaluate.
So every school has this written into their school improvement plan, an attendance goal. Sorry, I should say this. They have a school, an attendance. So we're actually right now planning for the summer. I know we just finished, but our team's already planning. We're really excited. We just hired a director of student attendance who will be mainly focusing on this and really, really doing a lot of this work. Because as you know, Mark has a lot of other things that he also oversees, and this really needed someone that was really dedicated. And the person we just hired has done extensive research around attendance, so we're excited. We haven't started yet, we will be. And so we do think that you're right. Some schools do, depending on the factors, do have some higher rates than others. But that's why way they all have their goals. So Mark right now is trying to put that all on one document for us, a spreadsheet, so we know each individual school. So that way, once we start going back out and meeting with teams, we can say what are some of the, because they don't only list the goal, they have to list what they're doing. So we want to support them in that. So if they're saying that, they want to get, students, because another thing is target, that's another whole other can of worms. But if it's something around tardiness, and that's their goal, how can, our team support you to be able to meet that goal? One, do we think it's attainable? Two, are the interventions you're choosing, is it the right interventions? So we want to have more of a hand in that, to really support schools as, part of their planning. And that, of what I understand, will continue to always be, because it's our child goal. And right now, we just barely met our target, which to me is not really a target when you're talking around 50%.
So the TAP goal for this year was 50%, rather than 40 and change. So we made the TAP goal.
And that's,
Still almost 50% after that.
Right,
So
it's
we're
not
not
anything
happy with that. But next year's TAP goal is 40%. So we have to get only 40. So that's going to be a big jump, right, from where we are now. And our middle schools and high schools struggle more than our elementary schools.
yeah.
Our middle schools and high schools, most of them get contact and fees already from 50%. So that's where we struggle. Our elementary schools tend to do better, as we know. But so middle and high school is really going to be a strong focus moving forward. And some of our high schools, their chronic absenteeism rate is almost 60%. So when you think about that, 60%, almost 60% of the kids are absent 10% of the year, which means 18 more days.
I also think we have to help support too with, a lot of our kids are overaged and accredited that are falling into that 60%. And in all fairness, we have to give them some more options because the traditional setting just isn't working.
Which also falls under our office because I oversee alternative learning programs. So that's something that we need to build out as a district. What do we have to offer those kids? Because to Sandy's point earlier, student engagement, why don't they want to come to school? Well, if you're overage and you're undergraduate and you're going to sit in a traditional Algebra 1 class when you've got 2 credits and you're 18 years old, it's not happening because you're going to need another 18 credits to graduate. So how can we get those kids into an alternative technical program and help them get their diploma? And so that they're coming in and doing that or something.
With whatever it is.
Because Sandy's point, in that 60%, a lot of those kids too. So they just disengaged at this point because the district has failed them up to this point. So now,
Yeah, and that actually just makes me think we need to be especially focused on middle schools. I imagine once kids start being chronically absent in middle school, they do it from high school until at one point they
And it
stop
happens
altogether.
because culturally, especially when you think about the Hispanic and Black population, these kids start having more responsibilities.
Jobs,
Not even the jobs, it's more like now you're responsible for yourself. You can get yourself ready. You can, eat your own breakfast. You can walk yourself to school. I've personally seen kids walk all through Adelaide to get to their middle school on this middle school that's over here. I don't know. And just, without a coat, without anything, just walking in the winter. And I know they're middle school kids. They look like, 27-year-olds, but they're very young kids.
Same thing at elementary. We have a lot of, as a past principal, I had many my students who, would walk their siblings to school. And, and I did elementary, so sometimes I had 5th graders who had, their 2nd grade, brother or sister and the first, and they, mom was working. Yeah, they had to get them dressed and get them to, I can tell you how many times we had to buy alarm clocks for kids because, they help, because there was no one there to maybe wake them up to remind them or whatnot. So, so I think, we're looking at different programs. We had a program last year, which was out of Tides, and it was called, it's a terrible name, but it was called the Tracker Program. And one of the great things about it was it made connections with kids. So it would in the morning check in with the child. So they'd say, Mark, are you on your way to school right now? And then, it was caseworkers. And if they said no, like, you need to get to school, and they would walk them through it. At the end of the day, how was your day? It kind of, and the nice part about that program was what they would do is if the child met their goal, whatever they set as their goal, they would serve as a mentor and take them out in the community, like to, the park or roller skating, or, the zoo, whatever they wanted. So it was kind of a nice relationship, and it helped the families, right? It helped the families who struggled. And so we had targeted it just at middle school last year, and we found some really great results with it. So we're looking at how can we kind of use that same program next year, so that way we can kind of continue that, ourselves. So we're trying to be innovative.
Is one of the arguments for shifting towards K through 8 that chronic absenteeism numbers are better for middle school students and that sort of thing?
I think yes. I mean, I think it would be. I think we have a lot of. So when we think about a fifth grade to sixth grade transition, I know people say, "Oh, it's a big transition," just like our eighth grade to ninth grade go to high school. Like those are two very big. So middle schools sadly have those two big transition years at their building. So one of the things that is nice being it's going to be some of our schools pre-K they'll form relationships with their principals, with their teachers, their support staff, so they can support them. Whereas when they're going from fifth grade to sixth, they're trying to get to know them, all over again. And by the time they get to know them, they're leaving in eighth grade. So I think that is a definitely, because we all know that building relationships with kids is the most important factor in anything. So
Tammy, I think personally, like you guys have a tough job. And I work in healthcare, and I just think about sort of like that consistency. You said something that really stayed in my brain, and it's the voice and choice for schools. And I support it, but I struggle with it because when you stop calling things the same thing because you feel like this word would be nicer, it loses some of its meaning. And so I get that it's hard for the district to tell schools, this is how you're going to name your teams. I get it. I get the culture. I get Rhode Island. I get Providence. I get it all. But I want the district to start looking at even the behavior of schools in terms of when teams look different. Like maybe we said call it attendance team, but we called it cool team, and now this team is doing better or worse because maybe they decided to eliminate some of the rules or change some things because they want to be different than what the district said. I just feel like consistency is so important. And if all your attendance teams are named the same, a parent moves from one school to the other, it's not different. They feel identified. They know who to talk to. I want to talk to the attendance team lead, and the front desk person is able to say, okay, I know who that team is. Just think about it. I get voice and choice, but for something as important as chronic absenteeism and the fact that we have so much inconsistency across the 20, 30 years that we've struggled with this, I would consider maybe mandating it. And I'm saying it on camera.
Yeah, we struggle with that same thing because, we want to, sometimes what happens is, and I know as a past principal, sometimes when things are done to me and I don't have very much flexibility, sometimes I don't always own it, right?
Yeah.
And I speak from a past experience as a principal. I think what is really, so I hear you, and that's something we struggle with all the time when we're putting policies into place because we don't want them to interpret it the way they want to interpret it. We want to make sure, which I think is why the guidance document that we're putting together is really important because for me, and I think Mark too, is we just want to make sure that they have all of the procedures down of what we're asking them to do, and that's part of the work. So, this year because we didn't have as much, one of our team members had left for another position, which we're thrilled for him, but it kind of left us void. So, unfortunately, our plan was to rotate consistently through the attendance teams and meet with them to, problem solve and just to support. We didn't get to do that as we had hoped, but that's where that will come in. If Mark is checking with the school and says, "Hey, show me a student's plan," and they have a plan. Now it's a different conversation. So I think you're right on that, and that's just something in general.
I get it.
Something in general that we struggle with.
And we're not great, we're not excellent in healthcare, but at least we try to like the same word is the same word across the board, because if not, people are gonna die, right? So it's not the same thing, but you wanna, I think education is just so like fluid that's.
It's always changing.
Yeah.
10 years ago, we called something
Yeah,
this.
no, I get
Now,
it.
and being here in the district for over 25 years, and Mark too, the same amount of times
Yeah.
like we could tell you how many different things were called. It is crazy. It is crazy.
Writing policy.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So Mark, you mentioned in a public margin comment that there will be a requirement for each school to hold a town hall.
Yeah, so we're requiring this year within the first, once we get the policy out to schools and to families, and I'm gonna actually get the date of when that is, so we can, as a student support team, go out and observe the town halls. We're gonna require that they roll out this, just in case a parent is not aware of it, they roll out the attendance policy with some key highlights, and they actually go through the importance of attendance. It could be both, right?
But there will be simultaneous translation.
At the town hall, there will be, we'll make sure that there is translation, because most parent meetings at the schools, they do, if they have parent organizations, they have translation there. They have, even if it's not provided by the district, they have staff there that translate for them most of the time. But yeah, so we felt that was important, that happens within the first 30 days. And to our point, at every school, so it's uniform for every school, no matter where your kid goes to school, the first 30 days of school, you're getting something on attendance. If you have a student at elementary school, you go to student at middle school, you're having the same thing happen in the first 30 days.
And a lot of schools do incorporate that into like their open
Yes.
house. It's a
Yep.
great opportunity.
And it can be done there, but it has to happen within the first 30 days.
Orientations right now will start to happen around K and, sixth grade, freshmen. So they'll get a lot of that message. The other thing we've also talked about too is at some point, our hopes, we have hopes and dreams, but one of our dreams is we can get a video together. And so as new families come in to registration, they can watch us, a little clip. Because sometimes if the child's being tested, the family's sitting there, waiting, so that they can watch a little clip about how important attendance is. And I think it's not just important how important it is, it's who to be able to identify is the point person. If you start to struggle or your child starts to struggle, who to know? We heard that a lot from families as we were doing our, as I've been sitting in and presenting at a lot of different events, a lot of times I hear from, parents of, I don't know who to go to in my school to ask, like, for whatever. So I think it's helping them know.
I should know the difference between excused and unexcused absences, but until I read your proposal, I didn't. So my son has missed some school in recent weeks to go see colleges, which I just assumed. We just have to put it back up.
So that's something too, though, Mark, that we're gonna actually talk to the state about. So, because it's vague in the compulsory attendance law that's passed by
General law.
general law, but you know
Yeah.
how that works. But, so, yes, going on a college visit is an excused absence. However, if you go on, like, I know this happened to some kids at class, if you go on 10 college visits, get 10 excused absences, but the absence still counts towards chronic absenteeism.
Right.
So how you're penalizing a kid who's going on college visits, you're gonna classify that student as chronically absent? That just makes no sense to me, right?
I was guilty with my son last
So-
year.
so
too.
That's something we're gonna try to see if we can get some kind of a little, a waiver from that, because I mean, come on. You want our seniors to be college and career ready, you want them to visit colleges and go to college, but then when they go on a college visit, it's gonna count towards their chronic absenteeism, that's crazy. Right? I don't know where we'll get with that, but that's something that Sandy and I are gonna bring up, like, how is that possible? Really?
I've asked the board for help.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
you can fight now as a parent with this one.
Well, I mean, the other piece of it is that we were thinking through, we could document that we were taking him to whatever school, but it wasn't actually clear to me as a parent, who do I give that document to?
Exactly.
I mean, classically you call somebody there, they'll tell you the answer, but my point is that, I should be super equipped to be able to figure that out, because I'm on the school board, but, most parents in the district, you're not on the school board, so we do want to make that line of authority reporting is for parents as possible is clear and as we possibly can.
Great.
So let's see. I think most. Are there other points you brought up in the comments that you want to?
There was the last one, but it was already addressed, which is where, bringing the information to the board more often,
Yeah.
because I just feel like, I don't like to be surprised and like 4 months go by and, oh, we're already at 25% chronically absent. So I would like to, like, if month 1, 20 kids never showed up, and month 2, 20 kids, if we're consistent, then we're making progress.
What did we have in there for
It says
the
quarterly.
quarterly?
Yeah,
Are you thinking quarterly is, you like to have them more often?
I was thinking, and I don't even know which data, so that's why I'm not gonna
Well,
say now,
our
but
top goal is the chronically absent, but I
Correct.
think
So-
the two that, Mark and I really
I
look
asked that every
is daily
board
attendance, and we usually look very close at daily attendance and the chronic absent. Those are usually the two major data, I mean, we look at all of it, but that's usually the two major data points that we look at.
so I was thinking, so you know how you come and you say these are the kids for homeschool? Also do like, this is how many kids were absent at each, in each, like like in elementary, in middle school, in high school, so that we sort of know that like, and then maybe next month it was less and or more, and and
So-
then at the quarterly you can say the reasons why.
So the policy stated, I put the Providence school board shall receive quarterly reports or as requested on attendance data, which includes demographics by school.
I think that's a nice way to word it because
We've never done it like that before, so I would say we'll
So-
probably have to talk to the president if that's,
yeah, that's what I was about to say because
yeah.
we're trying to sort of we I don't know whether I'm we
You're still we.
trying to sort of rejigger what we're and clarify what the board is asking for in terms of these reports that we're not supposed to get, right? So there's some data that is sort of more, I'm not going to use the right statistical term, but sort of less conclusive and more variable under a short period of time than a longer period of time. So when we are figuring out what we want to ask in terms of reporting, there's some stuff that makes sense to get monthly, other stuff that makes sense to get quarterly. So what I would say is part of the conversation maybe retreat or whatever it is, or actually really should be considering that. When do we want this data and how does it fit with the other stuff?
I like as requested.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
keep it
that
that
leaves it, that leaves it flexible.
Okay.
At the very least, it must be quarterly, right?
Yep, that's what we have it,
We have
quarterly
it
right now.
quarterly in there, yep.
Yeah,
And I don't know if you
know,
want to.
for me as a board member, when I'm looking at that data, I do want it broken down, I would want it broken down elementary, middle, high, but I would also want to get the as an appendix spreadsheet by
By
school, with demographic breakdown. And if it's possible to include some sort of more longitudinal or historical data, at least from the previous year.
That's what Mark and I have been doing. We usually always compare it to last year,
Yeah.
only because the year prior to that was still in that weird COVID time. So we've been really trying to compare it to last year. That's usually what we'll do. We'll compare last year to this year anytime we're looking at data
The longer
sets.
trend ones are so important for policymakers and those coming to kids with the longer data is so important because if we make progress, are we able to sustain it, or is there a steady pattern of increasing the problem in a particular government or something like that? So that kind of longitudinal data is really useful. Otherwise, it's just a snapshot in time. And it's really hard to do.
Yeah, that's
for
what
the
it is.
policymaking entity, so it has to look at that sort of broader. That's the virtue of the board. I think is that it can take that, that longer view because so many others, including superintendents, kind of come and go. And in the district, you guys can come and stay until you do. But you are the exception. You've been here. I got here. You were here. And you're still here. So
others can stay.
but you are the exception. I mean, you know better tan I do. I mean, faces I saw in this building 8 years ago are not the faces I see. So with you two being the exception. So yes, that is the virtue I think of appointing boards, that it can take that view. But we as a board need to know what data we want to do our job well, and then clear and ask you guys for. So,
That would be helpful only because we have so much data around the attendance. If you
Yeah.
pinpoint exactly what it is that you would like, then, Mark and I, a lot of times, when we're doing report outs, we keep the same template. Once we know what, what the group wants, we keep the same template and we just change in the data and update it each month. So that is usually what we do. So that's something easy.
and sometimes we're not, we're volunteer board without, policy experts on it, so we don't always know what to ask for. So that's where guidance from you guys, and stuff that you find useful and determinative, probably gonna be the same stuff. So,
Yeah.
that's part of why having a policy person working for the board is also really helpful, because that person can help us ask questions we didn't know to ask. So,
Hopefully you'll have that soon.
So I actually don't know who can answer this question. Charlie could, but he's not here. It has to do with the procedure of passing a policy. When we're creating a new policy, basically creating a new policy, it has to be on virtual meetings, meeting board meetings right after it comes to the committee. This is a revision of an existing policy and not a particularly old policy.
It is. What was the last? Was it 10?
2018.
I was gonna say, yeah.
The House,
Fairly. We've done so many, I forgot what this one, I think MTSS was 10 years. This one
Yeah,
was
this one's more recent because I actually worked on.
2018, amended policy committee review, June 16th, June 16th. So this is just 5 years.
Just 5 years. So it may be that this only has to be on one read. We don't have to settle that. Yeah.
That's what we did with MTSS.
Yeah.
We had one read, because again, we used the same one, we just did massive updates to MTSS. That would have been like 10 years.
So I'll find out the answer.
Okay.
It's not something we have to
Thank you.
do now. I guess the question would be whether you're prepared to, and are you make some.
I made some, but I'll go in based on this, I'll go in and clean up everything now and make whatever edits we need to make, and then it'll be clean.
That way you'll have the final draft of the draft,
Yeah.
so that way before I give it to Chiara to upload for school board, whenever that happens, I want to make sure you both have your eyes to make sure we incorporated everything. Mark, would it be helpful if you put whatever you changed in red? Usually that's what I do, so that way they know what is changed. Oh, is it?
I'm not
That's,
gonna put it in red, but I did it.
put it in red.
Yeah.
Maybe just go back to the top, and just highlight in red.
I would like to
change.
change the version. It's
And then,
Yeah.
yeah, that's fine, I'm clean up everything.
for me.
Yeah, I'll clean up everything you wanted me to clean up, I'll take everything out, and then you can give it one last, give me like maybe a week or so, maybe the end of next week, because I'm off for a few days on the phone, so. Yeah, maybe by like the end of next
There's
week.
like a few typos. in
Yeah, there is. I gotta go and clean all that
I'm
up.
still in grading mode. It's grading a
Yeah.
bunch of papers.
We had so many people look at this
It's
policy.
unbelievable how many people looked at this, like, you
I
go
can't
crazy.
even tell you how
Yeah.
many people, so, we tried to make copies so that we could capture each group's.
Yeah.
And then it was just like,
We lost track of
we
copies.
lost track of copies, we're like, let's just make this a copy.
Yeah, actually, collectively writing a document is really hard.
Really hard.
Really hard.
I don't know where this came from.
Laws are at stake. So I really appreciate the work you guys did on
Huh?
this.
Just share that one with me, can I just have that?
This one, yeah.
So, so I move that we pass the policy subject to the
Revisions?
tweaks that Mark's gonna put in there and share with us.
I second.
And so, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. It's silly, but it's counting. Okay, so, thanks so much to both of you guys.
Thank you, Mark, thanks for all your work
For all
on
the
the board and this
information.
policy, we're gonna miss you.
I
That's
know,
for sure.
thank you.
That's for sure.
This is the most fun stuff for me.
I know you've given such great insight into
Yeah.
all the policies. We're really
Well, we have great people on this
You
board.
do, we do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm,
We don't have a motion to adjourn.
oh, but yeah, I should do that. shouldn't I? Can I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
I second that motion. All in favor? say
Aye.
We are adjourned.
All right. If not, we'll still be meeting by tomorrow.